Okay. Is that working? Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, I can see it now.
Great.
And if you want to go into like presenter mode, if that works on Google Slides,
All right, cool. Here we go.
you're on. You're set. Thank you.
Yes. Well, good afternoon. My name is Justine Jadallah, and as you know, I'm a recent graduate on the program of the environment from UW. And my presentation is Environmental DNA, a case study of science communication between managers and researchers. So I discovered eDNA through my work with the CRAB team, which is part of Washington Sea Grant. And the CRAB team monitors invasive European green crab along Washington's shoreline. And because it's a citizen science program, they set traps and they work with volunteers. But my supervisor was working with eDNA for a project with the CRAB team to figure out if eDNA could benefit their efforts for monitoring. And when I learned about eDNA, I thought it was really cool, and I didn't understand why we weren't using it more for green crab. So for my senior research project, I wanted to explore the social barriers and like the benefits versus the barriers of using eDNA in this aquatic invasive species management context. And I specifically wanted to figure out if there are differences in perception of eDNA for like managers versus researchers and how that all comes into play when implementing it into a management setting. So my main research questions were, what are the benefits of eDNA as a tool for invasive species management? And what are the barriers to adopting eDNA into invasive species management? So as you know, since I interviewed most of you, I used interviewing for my method. So I wanted to get like a good range of perspectives because I know that eDNA is a very broad idea and it can affect many different groups of people and different backgrounds. So I interviewed managers, geneticists, people in policy, researchers, academia, and coordinators. And I went through, I transcribed all the interviews manually, and then I conducted thematic analysis to look for general trends related to barriers and benefits and just general important ideas that came up when talking about eDNA. So as I mentioned earlier, there was researchers and managers. So I had like the 6 groups, which was research, academia, geneticists, policy, managers, and coordinators. And I split them up into 2 different groups. So the researchers had research, academia, and geneticists, and management was policy, managers, and coordinators. And I had a bit of a skewed participant pool. So I had 11 policy people and 7 researchers, which might, that's a limitation to note. And then I also wanted to see if there were any regional differences in respondents because I got, I interviewed people from kind of all over, but because of my smaller sample size, I didn't get as many people as I wanted in different regions. So based on this, I only had 2 main groups that had a good amount of people to use for analysis. So the mountain region, which included Colorado, Montana, Idaho, and Utah, and the West Coast, which was Washington, California, and Vancouver. So those were the 2 groups I did my main analysis with, and the mountain region had 5 participants and the West Coast had 9. So the main things that I found for challenges was funding. And there was a variety of ways that this kind of came into play, but the main one was getting the funding to initially start up eDNA and use the equipment, mostly related to that, and also getting continued funding for these eDNA projects. Misperceptions was another one. People had different ideas about how eDNA should be used. Not necessarily the people I interviewed, but this is something that was brought up. So a lot of people mentioned that misperceptions of eDNA can create problems later on in terms of like tension or higher expectations for eDNA as a technology compared to other technologies. So it's a bit harder to implement it into a policy when there are higher standards for it that are really hard to reach with all the inherent uncertainty in eDNA methodology. Science communication was another challenge. This was specifically related to the communication of a detection, and normally in the context of researchers to managers, or like managers to the general public. So a lot of people brought up the fact that it's really hard to communicate a detection in an effective way that doesn't create more concern about the methodology. Mistrust of eDNA is kind of tied into this because of the difficulty with science communication and because of past detections from researchers that left managers confused and not sure what to do. That created a sort of mistrust of the eDNA itself. Additionally, some managers expressed that it can be scary because if you have this detection, but you don't have a species in your hand, and you have to justify these costs to the public who can't really see anything, don't have any physical proof, that can lead to some mistrust of the methodology if they can't actually see it. Standard protocol related to how we respond to a detection. So people were concerned about when to take action, when does a detection of concern, how many do you need to elicit a response, that sort of thing. And education just relates to how does the science work and how can we use it effectively. So there are also 6 common benefits that I found through my thematic analysis. Sensitivity is one of them. As you all know, since it's a more sensitive method, that can lead to increased detections and increased accuracy. Early detection rapid response was a common one. People were very excited about eDNA's potential to benefit this because it can help monitor species in low abundance, and this can help future efforts and reduce error later on. Since it can detect species in low abundance, it's a lot better for early detection specifically because we can help eliminate a population before it's established. Surveying broader areas with the third one. Decreased sampling effort was another benefit, for specifically in aquatic invasive species, because going out and taking a little sample of water in a water bottle is a lot easier than setting gill nets. Community composition was another benefit. People were very excited about the potential of eDNA to monitor community composition, especially in light of climate change and our future changing populations. And lastly, people liked that it was cost effective. So I also was trying to determine how people thought of eDNA as a scientific resource compared to how it can benefit management. So overall, everyone, regardless of background, said that eDNA had scientific value. But I asked another question, and it was, how can eDNA benefit invasive species management? And while everyone said yes, some people said yes, but with limitations. And if you look at this graph, you can see that the breakdown was pretty similar for researchers and managers, but overall, it was slightly more towards yes at about 55% and 53%. And depending on the background, as you can see, there were slight variations with yes, both limitations being around 45% for researchers and managers. So now I'm going to talk about some similarities. In general, as we've established, researchers and managers agree across the board that eDNA has scientific value and generally can benefit invasive species management policies. They also agree that early detection and rapid response is the best benefit. If you look at this graph, EDRR stands out compared to everything by a lot, and it's one of the only higher percentages from this statistic. Additionally, they also agreed that eDNA could be used as a supplement. So I asked people what the value of eDNA was in terms of how it should be used, and people consistently said it should be used as a supplementary method, as another tool in the toolbox, not as a replacement. There is some concern over the idea that it should be replacing other methods and that this wasn't the best way to go. So people agreed that eDNA should be used as a supplementary tool to guide early detection efforts. So there are also a couple agreements on barriers. The biggest barrier that was agreed on was science communication. 91% of managers mentioned this and 71% of researchers mentioned this. So mostly in terms of science communication, again, it's just talking about how do we communicate a detection and what does that mean? Another barrier that was similar was mistrust of eDNA and education. This is really interesting because it means that across the board, both groups understand that there needs to be more transparency and education surrounding how eDNA works. There were definitely a lot of differences as well in perceptions of eDNA. Sensitivity was a big one. For researchers, 71% noted it as a benefit and only 18% noted it for management. Survey broader areas was also larger for research compared to the managers. And there was also a massive difference in cost effectiveness and decreased sampling effort, with 55% of managers mentioning cost effectiveness and no researchers mentioning it, and 64% mentioning sampling effort and 29% of researchers mentioning it. In terms of barriers, standard protocol was slightly different, with researchers leaning more towards it and researchers leaning more towards funding. So what does this really mean? So this is just my interpretation of it, but these trends seem to be noting differences in perceptions of cost and effort. So while both researchers and managers are worrying about cost, it seems like there are different approaches to it. So while researchers are worrying more about having the funding to do this work and the benefits of it, managers seem to be more focused on how it will be an effective use of the funds. And this is really important to think about, because if we have these perspectives in mind, we can work better together as managers and researchers with these perspectives in the back of our minds and trying to figure out a way to address both of our concerns. There is additionally a regional difference between the West Coast and the mountain region. There are many explanations for this. There could be a lot of limitations. For example, the managers. And for the West Coast, I had about 50-50 for managers versus research. But in the mountain region, like 4 out of 5 of my participants were in policy. So that's an important thing to note. But it's interesting that for the West Coast, 57% of people said that eDNA has management value to benefit. But in the mountain region, it was, I'm sorry about that. That is the incorrect graph. But originally, there's this two-thirds of people in the West Coast said that it had management value, and 60% said it did, but with limitations for the mountain region. And this could be because of different species that they work with or how management works. So ultimately, the main solutions that were generally brought up by the people I interviewed were improving communication and education. So the main issue with communication is there seems to be a missing communication gap among how to respond to these detections and what these detections mean among managers, researchers, and the general public. And without this communication, that can lead to a lot of errors pertaining to how we interpret these results and a lack of proper use of it. One example of how to fix this is Canada's guidance on the use of targeted eDNA analysis for the management of aquatic invasive species and species at risk. This document does a great job of addressing the communication problems with eDNA. It outlines how to report eDNA detections for researchers to the management, and it also outlines what eDNA is and important terminology for managers. So this really streamlines communication and helps improve reporting. And I think that the government agencies here should benefit from that and kind of follow this example to reduce confusion and improve communications. The other thing we can do is increase education. So generally, based on the interviewee's response, there's kind of a lack of understanding about how eDNA works for the public, and a little bit of concern by some managers based on not quite understanding the science. So it's good for the public to understand, because they have to experience like the consequences, like water body shutdowns, and they also kind of determine the funding, and managers get worried about public perception. So if we can explain how eDNA works and get more support for it, that can help implement policy faster. One recommendation for this is an agency-hosted workshop to educate managers about eDNA. That could help them understand the science behind it, how it works, and how to interpret the results. Additionally, there should be continued education for resource managers. eDNA is constantly evolving. There are constantly new applications going on. And if we continue to educate managers as these things change, that could also help a lot with education. And it would encourage managers to be more confident in implementing eDNA when it's useful and creating a framework to understand the results. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge my site supervisors, Sean McDonald, Abigail Keller, and Emily Grayson, as well as my faculty advisor, Ryan Kelly, for all their support throughout the research process. I would also like to acknowledge the CRAB team, because without their facilities and resources, I could not have conducted my research. Lastly, I'd like to thank the individuals who participated in my interviews for this research project.